To please encourage people to check out April Waters with Two T's on YouTube. Please support my independent journalism or the Awake Radio and the number one with no spaces on YouTube. And my organic news podcasts are there with a PayPal link to support because, again, if we don't support each other, all you're going to get is propaganda, genetically modified news, and just more corporate spin. Please stay tuned for David Dayen and his article with The Intercept entitled Big Banks Suffer Rare Fail as Congressional Deal Cuts Nearly $1 billion a year in handouts.
Welcome to Organic News with Cat Waters. Revealing the truths behind the conspiracy. Every Tuesday. Welcome to Organic News with Cat Waters. Revealing the truths behind the conspiracy. Every Tuesday. From 6 to 8 Eastern.
Okay, that was a little bit strange. Now I am calling David Dayen.
Hello?
David.
Yes.
Hi, thank you for joining me on Organic News on Awake Radio.
No problem. Thanks for having me on.
So, David Dayen, you've been writing about politics since 2004, first as a blogger and then as a freelance journalist. You're a contributing writer to Salon.com, also writes for the New Republic, The American Prospect, The Guardian, Politico, Huffington Post, Alternate, Democracy Journal, Pacific Standard, and more.
I try to cover my bases.
Yeah, doing a pretty good job there. And you've been a guest on MSNBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, Current TV, Russia Today, NPR, Pacifica Radio, and Air America Radio.
And now this show.
Yeah, you could put organic news on.
Put it at the top of the list.
And so this article that you did for The Intercept, I'm pretty big fans of Glenn Greenwald and Jeremy Scahill.
Mm-hmm.
They know me not very well. Jeremy Scahill kind of knows me a little bit, maybe better than Glenn Greenwald, but I always go to their events and take my camera and film and try to interview them. But so your article that you wrote for them, it's called Big Banks Suffer Rare Fail as Congressional Deal Cuts Nearly $1 billion a year in handouts. So so for over the last 100 years, banks were getting a portion of a multi-billion-dollar government handout.
Yeah, let me explain what actually took place. So this goes back to the origins of the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve is created to handle the nation's money supply and monetary policy, and they want to get banks to be part of the Federal Reserve system. That would give them access to allow payments to be cleared. It would get them access to cheap lending. But they, at the outset, banks were a little wary of the Federal Reserve. It was a new system. They didn't really know what to expect from it. So the Fed offered an incentive. They said, okay, if you come on board the Federal Reserve System, we will, you'll have to buy stock in our system, because the Fed is sort of not really private and not really public. But you have to buy stock in the Fed, and then you'll become a member, and we will give you a dividend on that stock of 6% every single year. You can't lose the stock. The stock cannot go up or down in value. You will get it back if this disbands, but we will give you a 6% dividend. So every 17 years, you'll make back your investment and then some. And this has been in place for 100 years. Now, flash forward, the banks are not so wary of joining the Federal Reserve System. There actually are a lot of incentives to joining the Fed, including those that I just mentioned. I mean, access to cheap loans is a pretty good deal. In fact, banks that are chartered nationally, the biggest banks in America, have to join the Fed system by law. But for some reason, they never got rid of this dividend. So every year, banks keep getting this money risk-free, in many cases tax-free, every single year. In the last year that it's been calculated, in 2012, banks got $1.6 billion off of this dividend. And nobody really paid attention to it. It's something that was in the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, and no one gave it really a second thought. So actually, it was a member of a congressional staff that tipped me off to this, and I looked into it, and I wrote a piece for the New Republic about a year and a half ago, saying that this is absolutely outrageous. This is a free subsidy that's being given to banks, a fairly large one, and it's something bigger than the Consumer Financial Protection Agency's entire budget is this dividend.
Would you call it a bit like bank welfare?
Yeah, basically corporate welfare. And why are we allowing this to continue? Especially a 6% dividend. I mean, if you look at the stock market today, or if you look at the rate of return on any sort of investment, it's not 6%. I mean, that's a very good rate of return. Most dividends are not that big at all, but the Federal Reserve is handing this over to the biggest banks in America every year. So after I wrote that article, the Congressional Progressive Caucus, which is a collection of about 60 or 70 progressive Democrats, they put a budget together every year, which just represents sort of their ideal policy. And in that budget, they put, let's cut this dividend from 6% down to 1.5%, which this would make much more sense. This is an unjustified giveaway. Why don't we do that? Well, the Progressive Caucus budget, of course, lost. It got like 80 votes total. And I didn't really give this a second thought. And then a year later, Congress wanted to pass a highway bill. And they needed extra money because we pay for our upkeep and maintenance of our highways through the gas tax. And with gas prices down and driving fuel efficiency up, there is less money to be made off of the gas tax. And so they need to supplement that every year with other money they have to find somewhere in order to maintain the same level of spending on highways, roads, bridges, mass transit, things like that. So they're looking around for an additional source of money. And basically, as I understand it, Mitch McConnell is having a meeting, and Barbara Boxer is in that meeting, and Barbara Boxer pulls out the Progressive Caucus budget, and she points to this line item, and she says, what about this Fed dividend? If we cut that, we can get a large chunk of the money we need to pay for roads and bridges.
Good for her.
And so McConnell, amazingly, goes along with it.
Wow.
And he puts it in the Senate version of the highway bill, and it passes. The banks go nuts. They start swarming Congress with lobbyists, saying this is why are we paying for roads? They're making up all sorts of excuses for why this shouldn't happen. They get the Federal Reserve chairwoman, Janet Yellen, to say that this could have unintended consequences. It's very vague when she says that.
Like what? The bank's freaking out is the unintended consequence?
She doesn't really explain what unintended consequences those would be. but that is the terminology that she used.
Yeah, the banks are going to get upset. That's the only unintended
Right. The only
consequence.
it's a very intended consequence. When you take somebody's money away, they get mad.
But it's not
So,
really their money.
exactly. It's a risk-free handout. It's government's money that's being handed over because if the Federal Reserve didn't give this dividend, they would give that back to the Treasury. And so it really is, in essence, money that would otherwise go to the federal budget that is going to banks. So all of this, amid all this turmoil, the banks get some of their friends in the House of Representatives to write a new version to substitute this pot of money the Fed dividend paid for with another thing. Actually, it ends up being a raid of Federal Reserve funds, which is kind of interesting. But that passes in the House. So now you have two competing versions of the bill. One which pays, the Senate version, which pays for a portion of highway spending by eliminating this bank subsidy, and the other which doesn't, which pays for it through other means.
And guess
what happens when the House and Senate have bills that are slightly different but on the same subject, they have what is called a conference committee. And the conference committee irons out these differences between the two bills. And we were pretty sure that this would end badly for the side that wanted to see this bank subsidy cut. We were pretty sure that the bank subsidy was kind of done for. However, kind of miraculously, the conference committee report was returned, and the Fed dividend cut was still in there. It was changed slightly. Instead, it made a higher threshold, so it only affects banks that have over $10 billion in assets. This protects community banks and credit unions.
As opposed to $1 billion, right?
As opposed to $1 billion, that's correct. And then instead of cutting the dividend from 6% to 1.5%, it cuts the dividend from 6% to whatever the rate on Treasury bonds, which is essentially government debt, whatever that rate is in a given year. Right now, that rate is 2.2%, so it's a little bit higher. And if that rate is ever higher than 6%, it's capped. So you would never give a subsidy of more. The dividend would never be more than 6%, but it could be less. So that was the compromise. Instead of the initial version, probably would have cut about $17 billion in bank subsidy. This new version, it's a bit unclear, but I think it's around $10 billion. So the banks saved about $7 billion for themselves, but they still lost a significant sum. And more important, it showed that, the Progressive Caucus had never put an item in their budget that ended up getting passed into law before. And this is a very new kind of thing. And here we have a Republican Congress with full of pro-bank voices that ends up passing this law that cuts a risk-free handout to banks. It's really quite incredible.
Wow.
And the reason that I think it happened is it can be summed up in one word: preparation. I mean, the fact that the Progressive Caucus had this in their budget, the fact that there was this ready-made pot of money that they had available that Barbara Boxer could point to in that key negotiation, made all the difference. And it shows that even when Democrats or progressives or liberals are out of power, they should be thinking about good policies and writing them down and publicizing them and making them known to people, because you never know when that opportunity will arise for that policy to be put into action.
I mean, yeah, because the banks are like truly getting away with murder. Oh, that might be somebody calling in with a question.
Okay.
Okay, hold on. Hello?
Hi, this is Bill Stidham.
Oh, Bill, thank you for calling in Awake Radio, and the guest is uh, David Dayen and his article. Sorry, I just have to pull it up real quick. Big banks suffer rare fail as congressional deal cuts nearly $1 billion a year in handouts. David, are you familiar with Bill Still?
No, I'm not.
He Go ahead, Bill. Tell David who you. He did a documentary a long time ago on the called The Money Masters, and what was your latest one was called Jekyll Island.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I did one called The Secret of Oz in 2010.
So what's your question for David Dayen?
I have no idea what's going on. I have no questions for him.
Oh.
That's okay, Bill.
You, do you want do you want to share a little bit about, like, you know, the Fed and what we can maybe just get into a discussion? I wanted to ask David.
You know, I'd rather hear what you all are talking about than kind of chime in as I can.
Okay, so go ahead, finish what you were saying, David.
Well, I was just wondering what your question was.
I wanted to ask you about, you know, because in the last, you know, bunches of years, you know, since Occupy and people, you know, calling to end the Fed and just, or at least trying to educate the public on the fact that the Fed, you know, is not a government agency like people think, and that it's actually a privately owned, like, for-profit bank.
No.
Well, it's privately. It's not really private and not really public. When you go to the regional Fed sites, they're not .gov sites; they're .org sites. It's a strange hybrid, and they use that very much to their advantage. If you try to get information out of a Federal Reserve regional bank, they will often say that they are not subject to the Freedom of Information Act because they're not a government agency. There are tricks that are used to resist transparency among the Federal Reserve, and you know, and that leads to situations like we were talking about, where you have, and this is not the only thing, but you have this thing like the dividend, where you have this large payout to large banking institutions that was virtually unknown, because the Fed is kind of a secret garden. There's not a lot of information out there about it, and so it leads to situations like that. And so the fact that a blow was struck against these kinds of activities within Congress, which is not necessarily an institution that historically has pushed back against the banking industry, is very significant.
Because the Fed creates the, oh, I hear an echo, is creating the money now, and the Treasury is supposed to.
Well, I mean,
No,
the Fed
doesn't create money.
manages.
The Fed,
Oh, okay.
that's nonsense.
Okay, go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, go ahead.
The Fed doesn't create the money. The Treasury only creates basically 3% of the money supply. Those are the coins in your pocket. 97% of the American money supply and virtually the money supply of all Western nations is created by commercial banks as interest-bearing debts.
That's correct.
And I can give you an example of how that exists. When you go in to get your mortgage from the banker and you sign the final papers, does the banker go back in his vault and bring out a Santa Claus bag full of $100 bills?
Absolutely not.
No. He gets on his computer and he taps in a few numbers into something called an account of yours set up in the bank. At that instant, that is the instant of money creation. They don't have the money. They have the monopolistic privilege to create money at that instant, and that's where all of America's money is created.
So what's the function of the Fed then?
The function of the Fed is really to pretend that it's controlling the banks for the benefit of the American people, when in fact that's not really the case. We saw as a result of the 2008 congressional investigations into the 2007-2008 collapse, that the Fed was not even able to hold the banks to their reserve requirements. For example, they're supposed to maintain a 10% reserve requirement, and yet we found out from the congressional investigations that the large banks, JPMorgan and Citi, were leveraged 52-1. In other words, they had less than $2 for every $100 that they were lending out. Freddie and Fannie were leveraged 80-1, and the large investment house/banks were leveraged 333-1. So the Fed, the banks just do as they want, and the Fed is left to try to pretend that they're in control of the situation, but they really aren't. The banks are the ones calling the shots. And
what we saw after the crisis is the Fed engaged in
who controls its quantity.
Bill, just say that last point, and then David wanted to say something to you.
It doesn't. The whole background of this is that it doesn't matter what backs the money. That's not the issue we should be arguing over. All that matters is who is in control of the quantity, and certainly the banks are in control of the quantity right now. And since they are in control of the quantity, they are essentially the sovereigns of this country. The nation, the Congress, is no longer the sovereign. Really, the banks are the sovereign because they control the quantity.
Right, and what we did see after the crisis is the Fed massively expanded its balance sheet, purchasing up all the toxic assets of the various banking institutions, and creating what is now over $3 trillion balance sheet. And because of that happening, this created massive amounts of excess reserves that the banks have put into the Fed. And in fact, starting in 2008, the Federal Reserve pays interest on those excess reserves. And they instituted this at a time when they thought that the banks weren't going to have much in the way of reserves on the Fed account. But now there are trillions of dollars on the Fed account that they're releasing reserves on. And in fact, if and when, and the expectation is when, the Fed increases the federal funds rate, and that's probably going to happen in the next couple of weeks, that will increase the amount that the Fed will pay to banks to hold excess reserves within the Federal Reserve account. And this is something that's going to cost the government billions and billions of dollars going forward. It is a new way of undertaking monetary policy that has not been done previously in the United States. And it's going to be a massive amount of money transferring to banks to essentially being paid not to lend, being paid to hold reserves at the Fed. And this is something, again, that is not talked about, that is not really understood very well by the general public. But it is something that is just one of the myriad of ways that the Fed enriches the banking system, because of course the banking system owns the Fed in very real ways.
Yeah, that's correct. It's just ever increasing with funneling more money and more power into the hands of the banks. And what I meant by when I said that the banks essentially become the sovereigns, that means that they no longer just control the financial system, but they can use that money power to control the political system through the system of bribery of congressmen for their votes, which we call lobbying politely.
I just wanted to let Bill Still know exactly the topic of David's article was the fact that the banks were going to lose a portion of a multi-billion-dollar government handout that they've enjoyed for over 100 years, thanks to a compromised highway bill released Tuesday, which was like
a week ago.
Yeah,
and
a week
passed into law and been signed by the president now. This is a rare instance where the banks actually lost one. It does not mean that their power has been massively diminished in Washington, but it does mean that there was a coalition built that figured out a way to appeal to common sense and finally at least limit one of the very egregious handouts, one of the most brazen handouts that the Fed bestows upon the banking system. And I see that as hopeful. I don't know if other coalitions can be built, but it shows that if you recognize these weak points in the system and you get it out there and explain it and you capitalize on, in this case, the fact that in order to fund highways, some money was needed. If that kind of thing can be built again, we can figure that out again. We can continue to try to diminish this massive power and influence.
Well, it's for sure that the power of the Fed has at least been coming to light in the consciousness of the American people, not only the American people, but people around the world. So, hopefully we'll be able to do something. We certainly, the example, Iceland is leading the way right now. Israel is perhaps close behind, but Iceland has already put a good monetary reform proposal on the table that would completely solve their problems. And of course, they were forced into this, just as the Americans were forced into it during the Revolutionary War because they didn't have any alternatives as a result of the 2007 crash. So we'll see what happens, but I'm also rather optimistic in the next few years that we can really start to make some progress on returning the monetary power back into the hands of we the people.
Right. And of course, what Iceland did was jail their bankers.
Exactly.
And if you look at their economic performance relative to other similarly situated countries, particularly in the Eurozone, they performed better after doing that, even though they were warned not to. This is possible, and I'm sure shows like this and the work of Bill and everyone can continue to put out the message.
I actually filmed this talk with Timothy Geithner and Ben Bernanke when they spoke at the Union Square Barnes and Noble. When was this? October. Yeah, it was just in October. And I mean, although I don't have the exact spot on the video as to like where, Timothy Geithner is asking Ben Bernanke, just like certain questions. So I'm just going to play like maybe like a little bit of their talk, just for like a minute or so, if you guys don't mind. And I'm just going to start it at about I'm just going to pick a spot. Okay.
So talk about your views on what the gradual demise of Glass-Steagall meant in terms of the consumer crisis.
Oh, so I don't know if you can hear it, but Timothy Geithner is asking Ben Bernanke about Glass-Steagall. Yeah, I think I kind of picked a good spot to land on the video. So I mean, again, like I hope you can hear. I don't know if the audio is so great, but if not, I'll just try to translate.
How do you feel about the choice not to be imposed that division as part of the reform process?
Yeah. Were you able to hear? He's asking like about imposing or not imposing Glass-Steagall.
Okay.
Okay. Here's Ben Bernanke's response.
Glass-Steagall was one of the things that was repealed prior to the crisis. And it is true, I think, as a general matter, that some of the deregulation that took place in the late 90s, early 2000s was a mistake and contributed to the crisis. Why Glass-Steagall is always the poster child for that, I don't really quite understand.
Which are your favorite villains?
Can you hear? Oh, you can?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Well, there's issues of derivatives, things, and so on. But and, some of the rules for mortgage lending and things of that sort. But on Glass-Steagall, what Glass-Steagall did basically was say that you couldn't have regular commercial banking, making loans to consumers, for example, and investment banking, which is issuing new stocks and bonds. You couldn't have those two activities in the same firm. But if you look at the crisis, most of the firms that got into trouble were either investment banks or commercial banks. Investment banks like Lehman Brothers or Bear Stearns that got into trouble with their investments. Commercial banks like Wachovia, Wabu, and others made bad loans. So Glass-Steagall, if they would have prevented them from being the same company, but it obviously didn't have much to do with the fact that they got in trouble and they helped bring down the system.
Yes.
Do you agree with what he just said?
No, not at all. And I'd like to respond to it.
Sure.
So first of all, you saw Bernanke very skillfully avoid using the word Citigroup, which ended up taking the largest federal bailout of any institution after the 2007-2008 crisis. And Citigroup happens to be the poster child for Glass-Steagall. The reason Glass-Steagall was repealed was because Citigroup merged with Travelers Insurance and then dared the federal government to come after them for it because this was illegal under Glass-Steagall laws. And then they used their power and influence to get the Congress to retroactively bless that merger by repealing that law. And, Citigroup's MO was to, once the investment side and the commercial banking side merged, the investment side won out. It was a tug of war in corporate boardrooms between will the sober commercial banking, borrow short, lend long kind of boring banking style take hold, or was the investment banking go, take on as much risk as possible at all costs? Will that take hold? And then clearly the investment banking side took hold, and that accelerated. It was a force multiplier of the crisis. Second of all, it is absolutely ridiculous to say, well, the crisis, who got in trouble during the crisis was Bear Stearns, it was Lehman Brothers, it was Wachovia, it was Washington Mutual, whatever. It is ridiculous to make those points without noting who funded those investment banks and those non-bank operators, who provided the fuel to make the bad loans that were packaged up into securities. And the answer is the universal banks, the new hybrid commercial investment banks that were created out of Glass-Steagall. They created the warehouse lines of funding that every mortgage originator used, otherwise they would not be in existence. That's what every mortgage originator used to sell loans to anyone who had a pulse. And they were incentivized by those big banks by being told, give us more loans with high interest rates and bad quality, or we'll take away your funding. That's what they were told during the crisis, in the run-up to the crisis, during the housing bubble. And so there was an appetite that was created through the securitization of mortgage-backed securities. And the appetite was driven by the very banks that the Glass-Steagall repeal, which is called Gramm-Leach-Bliley, created. It is a complete dodge on the part of Ben Bernanke, Tim Geithner, Hillary Clinton, and everyone else who wants to play this line that the banks weren't responsible for the crisis.
And Henry Paulson,
it lets them completely off the hook for the fact that they fueled it with their funding of mortgage-backed securities and dodgy loans. And they know it. Ben Bernanke knows that, absolutely. And he's lying to you when he says that they were not a factor in the crisis.
Well, I wish you were there when these two were sitting up there. I mean, and it was a pretty full for Barnes and Noble, there was at least 300 or so
Mm-hmm.
people there, and his book is called The Courage to Act.
Right. When he did not act in any way under the Federal Reserve's consumer protection mandate that they had prior to the creation of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, they did nothing to police the institutions that created the crisis. Only after the fact, in an interview with USA Today just months ago, did Bernanke say, "Oh yeah, a lot of bankers probably should have gone to jail." There is absolutely nothing courageous about anything that Bernanke wrote in that book or did while he was the head of the Federal Reserve. He should be ashamed of himself to plant that title on his book.
I wanted to give Bill Still, if you had anything to add.
No, this guy's obviously very knowledgeable.
Oh,
I'm happy to listen to him.
Okay. I also just I wanted to kind of point out the fact that despite the fact that it was a pretty full house, hundreds of people. I mean, they all sat there and just sucked it all in. Like, nobody really challenged either one of these guys until I actually took my laptop and I did this radio show from the Barnes and Noble so that I would be there. Sander Hicks, who was a guest, was there live at the Barnes and Noble, and then Harrison Schultz and Lorna, who are advocating for Dennis Kucinich's The Need Act.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you're familiar with that,
No.
David or Bill, but anyway.
Yes. Kucinich's Need Act is deeply flawed.
Yeah.
Because of the governing body is structured quite similarly to the Federal Reserve today. It's a whole bunch of good verbiage in the first 25 pages. It sounds like it's actually going to solve the problem until you get down to the governing body, which is identical to the Fed.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, that's not good. But I mean,
Kucinich isn't in power. It isn't in office anymore, so it's probably a dead letter. Let me read you something that I wrote actually when Bernanke's book was released. It was the same day. I noted that the Fed, like all banking regulators, can initiate criminal referrals to the Justice Department for individuals they find to have broken the law. This of course, is the first line of defense to discipline criminal misconduct on Wall Street. And Bernanke had that power when he was head of the Federal Reserve from 2006 to 2014. The Federal Reserve, according to criminologist and law professor Bill Black,
Mr. Black
made zero criminal referrals for the entire breadth of Ben Bernanke's tenure. For him to say that bankers should have gone to jail while pursuing an innocent bystander strategy as if he had nothing to do with it is absolutely absurd.
I mean, how could you be the head of the Fed and be an innocent bystander?
Exactly.
I mean, that's like an oxymoron.
Exactly. And in fact, the one time that the Fed did take action, they issued these enforcement orders against 10 major banks over deficient practices in servicing and foreclosure processing. It's called the Independent Foreclosure Review. Third-party consultants were supposed to examine every foreclosure in 2009 and 2010, check for errors, and determine an appropriate level of compensation. What they did was they designed this process. It took 50 hours to complete a full file. It racked up $2 billion in billing for the third-party reviewers. The third-party reviewers were paid by the banks to review the foreclosure files and applications. The banks handpicked their own reviewers and are responsible for their payment. Whistleblowers allege that the reviewers, at the behest of their employers, deliberately minimized evidence of borrower harm. And in the end, the Fed decided to cancel the reviews. And they ordered the banks instead to pay cash less than $1,000 per foreclosure on average. Most people received for having banks try to steal their homes with faulty foreclosure processes. Most individuals received $300. And the checks initially bounced, by the way.
Oh my God.
So, this is what Ben Bernanke considered proper application of justice when he was in power at the Federal Reserve. And only when he relinquished that power did he decide the country should have punished bankers more severely. So it is the height of not just hypocrisy, but just insolence and arrogance.
And that's what kind of surprised me. So, when like no one except these like protesters, okay, they were advocating for the NEET Act that might not be, the best, but at least they were trying to challenge them. They were really outspoken and yelling out, and it prompted a discussion with a couple of people who showed up, but other than that, no. It's like, here's how many times do you get an opportunity to confront the people that are like behind the crash of 2008?
Well, I just believe there is quite a bit of ignorance out there. It's not necessarily something that everyone should blame themselves for. A lot of it has to do with the fact that we have a corporate-run media that does not offer a full panoply of information to people. It's very hard to find sources of information about these kinds of things, but it is undeniable. The Fed is kind of this secret garden, this golden temple that it's very hard to break through and get transparency on. Of course, what we know is that Bloomberg took years to, and they had to sue the Federal Reserve to do it, to get the list of who they lent to after the crisis in terms of emergency lending. And what we found is that they were lending to any and every organization, foreign and domestic, whether they were banks, whether they were not, using collateral that was absolute junk, and they knew it was junk. This is what they did, the enormous lengths to which they went to protect the financial system,
Right,
in America and around the world, whereas homeowners, ordinary people who were laid off, were not given the same level of satisfactory treatment.
right. And
Well, if I could make a suggestion, and that is, I don't think we really should call it the financial system. I think we should nomenclate it to it's the debt money system.
Exactly.
It's not what a righteous financial system should really be. And the Fed
Amen.
is just a joke. It's literally the curtain in the Wizard of Oz to try to make you think that the government is there to do something, to control the banks, when the Fed is virtually helpless before the power of the biggest bank.
Mm-hmm.
So, I definitely agree that I'm always pointing out the fact that we need to call things what they are, because, just recently, I just want to make this point, like, they call money wealth, like, and it isn't really. They had Amy Goodman is at the COP21 in Paris, and they're talking about, climate change, and I don't know if you guys agree with it. I definitely, do think that we're destroying the planet for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And, we have to be, because capitalism has completely broken away from anything real. And she had a guest on that kept, talking about wealth and the elite and the super elite and all this stuff. And I just kept thinking to myself, you can't have it both ways. You can't be at a climate conference and be admitting that we're destroying the planet, which clearly has real wealth, and then at the same time, call what's destroying that wealth.
It's 8 o'clock.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that doesn't make any sense. But anyway, yeah, so I want to thank both of you. Bill Still, thank you to David Dayen and his article.
It's Dayen, by the way.
Oh, sorry, what am I saying?
That's all right.
Dayen. And your article can be found at The Intercept. Big banks suffer rare fail as congressional deal cuts nearly $1 billion a year in handouts. And
Well, thank you so much for having me on the show.
You're welcome.
All right, take care.
Bye-bye.
Okay, well, that does it. Oh, I forgot I wanted to mention John Lennon. This is the anniversary of the death of John Lennon. Yeah, let's try to imagine and not just imagine, but actually create a better world where we value more things that have real value other than the fake measure of wealth and success that man makes up, which is really addiction and just being a junkie. And please go to April Waters with 2 T's on YouTube and Awake Radio and the number 1 with no spaces on YouTube. And please support truth in media. Thank you. Happy holiday.